Hey, it's Fanuel here, your host of Questions of the Day, where I take you on my journey around the world to uncover the practice of civic science in order to understand who does what, where, when, how, and everything in between. In this conversation, I talk with Brean Prefontaine, a postdoc at Duke University who has been creating a workshop that focuses on how to evaluate the impact of public engagement efforts. As you may know, evaluation is a huge pain point for those doing engagement work across the different parts of what I would like to call the civic science universe. Anyway, in our conversation, Brean tells me this.
I've seen that. And then also thinking about the data that's being collected. So, like, what voices are being heard in that data? Are we talking to everyone that is going to be impacted by this program? Or are we only hearing a couple of voices? So I think all of those, like, critically thinking about how the evaluation is, hitting on the different facets of the people that are involved in the program, I've heard of a lot of work in that direction.
Well, let's dig right in, and I encourage you to think about the broader civic science universe as Brean answers my many questions. Previously on Questions of the Day.
What is this landscape looking like for translation services, and what are you hearing here at the ASTC so far?
Great question. I'm seeing there's still a lot of interest in reaching communities. How do I put more than one language we're interested in, or people are really, more and more institutions are willing to take the step to be accessible.
Brean, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so I got to hear your talk about a little bit about your work at the Research America Microgrants showcase, if you will, a couple months ago. And I knew I had to have you in my program because you were talking about evaluation, and that is music to my ears. It's something that I always hear about when I'm talking with folk on the field. And so I knew I had to have you. So again, thank you so much for having you here. I wanted to just get started by us taking us back a little bit and telling us your journey into evaluation. How did you get into this space?
Yeah, so I took a really roundabout path in grad school that sort of led me to evaluation. So right after I got my bachelor's degree in physics, I decided to go to grad school. I started a physics PhD program. I was doing physics education research, and like grad school is really hard as it is. But the pandemic happened while I was in grad school, and it just like things were really hard, and then that just made everything worse. So I actually decided to leave with my master's, and I moved to where I live now, which is North Carolina. I was looking for a job, and I ended up working at this research firm that does mostly external evaluation work for STEM education projects. So while I was working at this research firm, I learned all about evaluation. I didn't know anything really before working here, or before working there. I don't work there anymore, but I learned all about external evaluation and what that meant and how important it was. And I was basically won over. I was like, wow, evaluation is great. So while I was working at the research firm, I was encouraged to go back and finish up. So I did, uh, finish up grad school. And then I started a postdoc position at Duke. So I no longer work at the research firm. I'm a postdoc. But I still think evaluation is really important. And I like to talk to people and help people think about evaluation for their own work.
Yeah. And so on that note, let's start with the big picture. Can you give us a take right now where, and that this might be difficult as well, just give us a sense of evaluation as a field right now. Where are we right now? What are some major questions that you're hearing on the field as someone who is deeply steeped into this space?
Yeah. So I think there's been a bit of a shift for the better. So it used to be like, how many people am I reaching with my project? Like all numbers, like how many people are coming to my events, like how many people am I impacting? And now I think the shift is more, at least what I've seen recently, it's been more like, how are we impacting people? We're asking more like how questions, what is happening with our programs or events, and um I just think it's a more rounded view of how things are impacting participants. And so that's really exciting, I think, as a field for really moving in the right direction to get a whole picture, a complete picture versus just numbers.
Yeah. And that I think translates into, gathering more data, right? Different kinds of data.
Yeah.
Try
Yeah.
to
Thinking beyond just numbers.
right. To answer the key question about what is, beyond outputs, right? Into outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of it is thinking critically about like what do we even want those outcomes to be with our projects? What are the long-term outcomes that this program is trying to achieve? And I think that's evaluation is also helping people think about that as well, because you have to have an idea of what you want the outcomes to be before you can try to measure it.
Yeah. Give us some other questions. What are some other questions you're hearing from the field, from your other fellow colleagues that are asking more in general?
Yeah, I think there's also been a big push to think about culturally responsive evaluation. So, uh, you know, is this program having different impacts on different groups of people? How do identities play into that? Maybe that's racial and ethnic identities, maybe it's gender identities, but just thinking about like the identity of the participants and like what they're getting out of the program has been something that I've seen a lot about. Um, Also, like thinking about justice, like justice and evaluation is something that I've seen a lot about. So this comes up more specifically if like the program or the event or whatever is being evaluated, if that has like a justice angle or um maybe DEI, like a diversity, equity, and inclusion angle, then like incorporating more of those elements into the evaluation. I've seen that. And then also thinking about the data that's being collected. So like what voices are being heard in that data? Are we talking to everyone that is going to be impacted by this program, or are we only hearing a couple of voices? So I think all of those, like critically thinking about how the evaluation is um, hitting on the different facets of the people that are involved in the program. I've heard of a lot of work in that direction.
And this gets me thinking. There was a recent session from the National Academies that I attended. Susan Renault was talking about her dream, where if the NSF, for example, right, the evaluation is a key component of all their grants, as you know. And she was saying it would be great if we can find innovative ways of making sure like these impacts, right? How do we communicate these impacts? So collecting them, and then the next hurdle about communicating them and collectively talking about the impact, right? It's good to track individual programs, but how do we collectively discuss, right, the outcomes of all these projects, right, from the evaluation?
Yeah, I think funding agencies are definitely thinking about this because I've also heard that NASA is thinking a lot about this too. Like, how do we collectively look at the impact of all the different programs that we have going on? I say we, but NASA. I'm not involved with NASA, but thinking about like what is the impact of all these different things when looked together as a whole. I think that's really important too because you know otherwise we just have one-off events or one-off programs and we should definitely be thinking about things as a whole and the collective impact. I agree.
Now, thank you for that 10,000-foot view there. One of the things, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've been developing this workbook, right? Through support from Research America, Civic, micro grant. Can you tell us about that, the genesis of that project, and then some of the latest developments? Because we've been working on it for a little bit.
Yeah, so last fall, it's hard to believe it's been almost a year, but last fall I saw the call for applications for this mini grant program through Research America. And I immediately thought, oh my gosh, I should do something about evaluation to help folks think through evaluations for their own programs or events. And I had heard from a lot of different people that evaluation is really hard or they don't know where to start. And so I was thinking about, some kind of training material or something to help people get started would be great. I initially proposed a workshop, and I did do 2 iterations of the workshop. But what became really apparent is, 1, a 1-hour workshop is not long enough to talk about evaluation. It takes way longer than that. And 2, it's really hard to return back to, like, a recording of a workshop or, to, like, look at your notes from a workshop and figure out what to do. And so I was trying to think of something more sustainable, something that people could use in the planning phase, like really come back to. And so that's where the workbook came from, this workbook idea. So I'm working on creating a workbook that will, what I hope will be a start to finish guide for doing an evaluation. And I've been working on it for a while because I have found out it is really hard to make a workbook, harder than I imagined. But I'm really hoping that by the end of this semester, so by the end of fall semester, 2025, the workbook will be complete and ready for people to use. I'm hoping to get some feedback, like some trials, some testers, we'll say, so test users on the workbook before I make it totally public. But that's sort of been the process, or where the idea for the workbook came from.
Yeah. And so I can imagine people asking, so aren't there others out there that are already the workbooks, that is, right? Because I think part of the
Yeah.
challenge is navigating the evaluation space. There's so many resources all over the place. And people can also argue that there's a lack of resources as well, right? So can you give us a sense of how does this workbook plug into that ecosystem? And then a critical question here, who the target audience is for this workbook.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about like making training materials, I started looking at what was out there, and you're right. There are a lot of resources. There's both like a lot and not a lot of resources about evaluation at the same time. It's very interesting, but you can go down a rabbit hole and find a ton of resources. And so I started collecting all these resources together. There are workbooks out there. The ones that I have found focus on like a specific part of the evaluation. So again, I'm really hoping this is like beginning to end. Like if you don't know where to start, like how can we write some evaluation questions? How can we figure out the data to collect? How can we collect the data? What do we do after we have the data? Like what's next? Which is something that I didn't see a lot of resources about. So I'm hoping it's like a beginning to end resource that people can use. And also like throughout the workbook, I'm trying to point people to existing resources that are out there so that if people want to take like a deep dive into, say, like data collection, there's a ton of resources out there about data collection. So, I'm hoping that folks can look at some of the resources that I have found to get a deeper dive on that. But in terms of who is supposed to use the workbook, it is people who are running or creating, I'm going to say an informal STEM program, but, a civic science program that, they have the idea of the program, or maybe they're already running the program and they just don't know what to do for the evaluation piece of it. Maybe they have been asked to do some evaluation. Maybe they want to do evaluation, which would be great, but they don't know where to get started. So that's sort of who the workbook is for. People who are trying to figure it out, don't know where to start. And also, I think it is mostly for, well, it's easier to say who it's not for than who it is for. But right now, the workbook focuses on more traditional data collection methods. So interviews and surveys and observations. So the workbook would maybe be less helpful for people who do media. So maybe they have a website or they're trying to evaluate a podcast that they have or something like that. I think that I haven't quite ventured into that space yet. But if you have something like a summer program or a workshop for teachers, then this would be a great resource to figure out how to evaluate that program.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're talking about a full spectrum, right? Someone who is thinking about evaluation, but you're taking them through all the steps. Right, not just you design it, taking through, you get the data. What do you do with the data, right? And is that given going back to my previous question, maybe the phrasing was incorrect. Maybe a better question could be, in terms of categories of resources that are out there for evaluation, right? There's one aspect, maybe yours, where this comprehensive view, right? You take someone from the beginning to end. Is that kind of the thinking that you had in mind or have in mind?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I wanted to be like a comprehensive. So it is sort of, I will say, a little bit high level. I keep thinking of things I want to add to the workbook as I'm working on it, which is making it longer and longer. So there's a little bit of a fine line I'm trying to tread here between like all the information versus like let's just get someone through an evaluation. But I'm definitely thinking it falls into like the comprehensive resource category. Like how can we just get you started so you're doing some sort of evaluation. So maybe folks who already are doing an evaluation or already have an evaluation in place, also this workbook might not be so helpful for them, although I would hope that maybe some tips and tricks in there would be helpful. But I think it's really for just getting someone started, and just getting some kind of evaluation off the ground.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Could you give us some examples? What's in this workbook? Just give us
Yes.
a.
So like I said, it's I'm trying to have it take you from like beginning to end. So the very first thing in the workbook is sort of a section that just describes what is evaluation, how is this different from research? What is it? Why should you do it? That kind of stuff. And then so the actual workbook part starts with having the reader or the user identify the goals of their program, and then take those goals and turn it into some like big picture guiding evaluation questions. So like what questions are you hoping to answer with your evaluation? Then I have a section that is thinking about data. So what data should we collect? Like what data would be appropriate to answer those questions? Um, like timeline for data collection, how can we plan for data collection? Who is collecting the data? That kind of stuff. Um, and then I have a section about data collection instruments. So something that I've heard from a lot of people is evaluation is difficult because there's not just like in most cases, there's not just a survey that you can take off the shelf and use for your program. And a lot of people say, "Oh, it's great. Evaluation's great because you can make something really specific to your program and get really specific feedback." But for some folks, that's really difficult. If I can imagine someone saying like, "I don't have a background in creating surveys," like, and now you want me to create a survey, I don't know what to do. So I have a whole section on, some tips and tricks for creating a survey, or if you want to do interviews, creating an interview protocol. And then the workbook kind of ends with like, how do you analyze the data once you've collected it? And then what do you do with that data? So how do you use your findings? How do you think about improvements to your program or incorporate it into like a report, an annual report for your funders or your community members or things like that. So yeah, so again, I'm really trying to like walk people through the whole process. And then something I'm really excited about is I'm trying to include specific examples in the workbook too. So when I did the workshops in the spring, so the workbook kind of came out of these workshops. When I did the workshops, some of the feedback that I got from the workshops were, it'd be really great to have an example, like maybe you show us how you would evaluate a program using these steps. And so that's what I'm doing in the workbook. So I'm taking a program that exists, and I can tell you more about that program if you're interested, but I'm taking a program that exists and then sort of for each section of the workbook describing like, these are the evaluation questions that I would write to evaluate this program. This is the survey that I would use to collect data, so on and so forth, so people can see an example.
Yeah, actually, with that, I would love to get get a sneak peek into that as well. Maybe just give us a sense, right? Give it a kind of context of the program that you evaluate, and also how often do you do this in the workbook, right? Is it a few examples, or is it really the core bread and butter, right? That you have these examples spread throughout the workbook, as people can really see, right? Because there's no one way of doing public engagement, right? There's so many ways one can do this, and each program has different needs. So yeah, examples. I love some.
Yeah. So the one core example that I'm like threading throughout the workbook is it's a real thing. I did not evaluate this event, but it's a real event. It's called Plasma Science Teacher Day. It happens in conjunction with the American Physical Society's Division of Plasma Physics conference, which is like a mouthful, but there's this annual conference for plasma physics. And right before the conference, they have historically had a teacher's day. So local teachers are invited to come do a day of workshops to learn about plasma physics, to learn about activities that they could do in their classroom. And then they're given like a kit that they take with them to their classroom, and so they can actually do the activities. And it was suggested to me that I use this as an example for one of the workshops that I did, because a lot of attendees at that workshop are doing plasma physics related, informal activities. So we wanted like a relevant activity or relevant example. But basically, I go through in the workbook, each section of the workbook, I use that example and like have a very in-depth explanation of what I would do and how I would go about it. So I have a survey that I developed that I did not use. I have not evaluated this. I'm not the evaluator for this program, but I have a survey that I would use to evaluate this program, and an interview protocol. And the hard part is I don't have data, so it gets more difficult near the end of the workbook in terms of like analysis. But I do talk through like, once I have the data collected, here's the analysis that I would do and how I would try to use the findings. Although you make an excellent point in that there's a whole spectrum of activities that people could be doing. Maybe they're not working with teachers, but they're working with students, or maybe it's a virtual event. And so for that, I'm trying to have like very short examples throughout, like differentiated, like here's a very quick example of some questions you might ask for a virtual event, or here's a very quick example of the data you might collect if you're doing a summer camp with middle school students or something like that. And so those are like shorter, less in-depth examples that I'm sprinkling throughout the workbook as well. But it's hard to like get the whole spectrum of events since there's so many things people could be doing.
Yeah. I mean, and you led into my next question, really thinking about what was difficult about pulling this together, right? Because there's diversity of programs that are out there. So which one do you pick, right? And I'm just curious, and from your end, how did you sort of calculate the calculus to say, okay, I'm gonna focus on this type of programs versus another?
Yeah, so the the example that you used throughout was a request. Someone requested that I have a plasma related example for one of the workshops that I did. So it's just sort of like I had that content already created and was trying to just get going on the workbook. So that's where that came from. But I did think a lot about like, what do I talk about, especially for the data collection and data instruments sections? There's so many different types of data you could collect. There's different instruments you could make that could look all different ways. And I just had to make the decision, let's just focus on interviews and surveys, and then point people to existing resources if they want to look at other types of data or other types of instruments. So it was just sort of a, this is a quick and dirty guide to get people started on evaluation. This is not supposed to be like the end all be all resource for what you could do. And so that's kind of how I made that decision. And then like, as I'm still creating it, I mentioned earlier, like I'm really trying to make decisions between like giving enough information to get people started versus overwhelming people with information and making this like too long, more of a book versus a workbook. I'm trying to keep it kind of short and sweet. So I've been trying to make like content decisions as well.
Yeah, it sounds like you were going for low activation energy, right? And the way quick and dirty, so someone can say, okay, I want to design to plug this in, look at it. And you were discussing earlier about the utility of this. I think one of them also is potentially grant writing, right? You can imagine someone looking at this.
Totally.
You might deploy some of these insights into a grant so that the funder can see that I have a plan in place.
Yeah, I think there's like two ways that I think this could really, really help for grant writing. So one is if you have an existing program and you're trying to get more funding, if you do some evaluation, collect some data, and you have some findings, then you can use those findings in your grant proposal to show like, hey, this is the impact that we've already had, or this is what we're seeing in our assessment give us more money to do more amazing things. I think that would be one really good use case. Another use case is if you're writing a proposal and you've never done this program before, but you're proposing a new program, you should have like a well thought out evaluation section. And usually I feel like the evaluation section in a grant proposal is like so short. People write a paragraph and they move on. But if you sit down with the workbook, or this is my hope at least, if someone sits down with the workbook and they think through, okay, what are the actual goals of what I'm proposing? And what are some evaluation questions that I can ask to see if we reach those goals? Then they can include those evaluation questions into the grant proposal to show that they've like really thought about what questions the evaluation can answer. And then if they go a step further, they could even think about, okay, what data can I collect to answer those questions? And then you can have like a very short sentence or two or even paragraph about data that you might want to collect. And then I think that shows like a really well thought out plan for, okay, I want to do this new program or this new event. This is how I'm going to make sure that it went well or that we're achieving our goals, or this is how I'll think about improvements or ways to improve the event over the years or the life cycle of the grant. So I think my goal or my hope is that people start thinking about evaluation in the planning phase of events. And I think this workbook could be really helpful for that too. Because you can go through the workbook and then put your whatever you write in the workbook, you could put that in your grant proposal. And I think that would make it a really strong proposal. Hopefully.
I like what you said at the beginning. You start with your goals, right? So thinking John Besley's SCREE, for example, the framework, it's going to be strategic, right? First letter there. So it's goal oriented. So it sounds like yours is as well. But yeah, tell me if I'm wrong, but part of this as well is you have accumulated other resources in this, right? So it's not the end be all, but you're pointing those who are using the workbook to other places. Okay, you want to develop this further, look at this resource over here, right? So you did some curation to navigate this growing this landscape of evaluation.
Yeah. So for example, I guess a really concrete example there is like in the very first section of the workbook, like the very first workbook section, I'm having users think about goals. And I was like, there's so many resources for ways you can think about goals. You could try to put together a logic model or a theory of action, or you could just sit down and write out what outcomes you want your program to have. And so I am pointing people to additional resources for like, hey, if you want to create a logic model, here's a really good resource for that. Or if you want to create a theory of action, here's a really good resource. Because I think having all of that in the workbook would be overwhelming. Then people would be like, oh my gosh, I have to do all this before I can even move forward with my evaluation. And I don't think that's true. I think if you just identify goals, you can move forward. But also creating a logic model would be like a really great step. And so people could look at those resources to do that if they want to.
Yeah. There are resources out there for building logic models as well. And you threw in a couple terms of the logic model, theory of change, all these things that I'm assuming in your workbook, you do go through what they mean and so forth. So tell us about the frame, like what is this workbook? Where is it living right now? And is it going to be online? Is it a PDF? Tell us what is the structure of it?
Yeah, so I wish it was done. Like I said, creating a workbook takes so long, much longer than I thought. But right now I'm creating it to be a PDF, hopefully a fillable PDF. So either you could print it out and fill it out by hand, or you can just, put it on Google Drive or whatever and fill it out. And it's going to be online. It's going to be freely available. It's not finished yet, so it does not exist online yet. But I will have it, Fanuel, I can send you a link for one place where it will live. I'm hoping it'll live in multiple places. But yeah, it's not done yet, but it will be done. It will be done hopefully by the end of the semester. And so hopefully there'll be a link, associated with this video so people can find the workbook.
Yeah, definitely. We'll put that on there as well. And what is your hope? Like, how would you, once it's out, what is the hope for you? And what signals will tell you that it was a success, or maybe some other word, right, in terms of whatever impact or outcome means for you.
Yeah, I think you're asking me how I'm going to evaluate my workbook about evaluation.
You got it. Exactly right.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and this has like been something that I've been grappling with actually. Is like, how do I, you create this resource, how do we figure out if it's good? So one thing I want to do, and I've already asked a couple of people, is I want to get some feedback before I let it go live. So I've asked a couple of folks if they're willing to look at it, maybe try to use it, give me some feedback. So I'm hoping that this like October, November, that feedback cycle will happen. So to iterate a little bit on the workbook. And then once it's live, I at the end of the workbook, I'm encouraging people to email me or reach out for questions or feedback. So I'm hoping like a little bit organically, folks will get in touch if they have anything pressing that they would like to tell me, good or bad. I'd love to hear it. Other than that, I don't know. I do hope to host more workshops. So the Research America mini grant helped me host 2 workshops about evaluation. I'm hoping to host more workshops in the future. And then through those workshops, hopefully, point people to the workbook or talk through the workbook and then get live feedback through the workshops. But yeah, this is a really good question about how do I evaluate a resource that I just put out there for people. So I need to think more about exactly what I want to do. But yeah, I'm hoping that it's an ongoing feedback cycle and that I can collect people's feedback.
Yeah, and I love that it's in progress, right? That we're not talking about something that's completely finished. We're getting to see your thinking, right, in real time as you're building this resource and how you're thinking about evaluating, right, the impact of what what it'll do out there. Some things that come to mind for me, if we think about outputs, for example, right, a number of practitioners or scientists who end up citing that they use this, right, in their grants or
Yeah.
in their papers, right? You can imagine having a way to do that. That's why I was asking you, where will it live? You think, for example, about publishing journal in the Journal of Science Communication, for example, the practice insights where you can begin to track those metrics more formally, right? Citation. And then going beyond the outputs, right? So outcomes now is that, yeah, if indeed they are successful in getting grants or they are able to actually deploy some of the suggestions that you've added in the workbook and sharing, right, what worked and what didn't. Either way, it's still useful, right, in that sense. So I think there's so many angles, right, and you're figuring it out in real time.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said about maybe formalizing, like, people can maybe cite that they use the workbook or even come back and tell me, like, if they got a grant from, where they included their evaluation work in the proposal. I think that'd be great. So, yes, more to come, I suppose, on how I will evaluate the usefulness of this workbook.
There's a lot there, and even the NSF ASOL, right? I'm still reading through the RFP, the new RFP for. It's no longer called the NSF ASOL program, by the way. It's I think the NSF STEM K-12, and evaluation now it's sort of less. It's not an external evaluation is not a requirement per se. It's now sort of seeing more of the PIs and will be submitting grants to think about plans, right, internally built in. Because the dollars are smaller, so hiring an external evaluator might be outside the purview. So a resource like yours could really is timely, I think, to support that thinking now.
Yeah, exactly. Because maybe you can't hire someone external to do it, and then you won't have that support even in writing the proposal. Like, I think, yeah, folks are going to have to think through this more, maybe on their own or within their PI teams. And so I'm hoping that this resource is really helpful.
Yeah. And now I wish we can just keep chatting, Breanne. This has been so useful, and thank you for sharing these real-time inputs. Now, something that I didn't mention earlier, or asked you about, is that you did this work with support from this micro grant, right? And,
Yes.
and I just want to speak a little bit about just how important that was for you to do this work, right? Because I think that's something that we don't talk about is it requires funding to do this, right? Evaluation requires
Yeah.
funding more broadly, and then you are building a resource that also requires funding. What did the funding enable you to do specifically that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
Yeah, so I think none of us would exist actually without the funding. I'll just start there. So without Research America and the mini grant program, I'm not sure that I would have been able to carve out time. I think time is one of the big things that enabled me to do. And so I'm not sure I would have been able to carve out time to like sit down and critically think through these things. I wish if I could go back in time, I wish I would have applied for the mini grant with like a team of people or at least a colleague so that I could do it together because one thing that was challenging was doing it on my own, which I think is one reason why making the workbook is taking a while. But being a part of the mini grant cohort, I guess I could say, has been great because I've asked other folks who also received funds from Research America about their thoughts. And we had to do like the showcase presentation, and so that was great to get feedback there. And so I think just this like process of being in community with other people who are doing civic science work and who have funds to think about this work has been great. I also will say it allowed me, so I did 2 workshops. So the funds allowed me to, one was virtual and one was in person, so to travel to the in-person workshop um, and actually do the workshop, have the time to do the workshop and prepare the materials and all that stuff. So uh yeah, the funds have been great. I will say beyond trying to make this resource, I have learned a lot. So I started making the workbook in Word and I was like, wow, this is terrible. And I have since switched over to Canva and I've been like teaching myself some like very, very basic graphic design elements. I don't want to get anyone's hopes up too much, but I'm trying to make it more visually appealing and user friendly. And so I guess I say all that to say the funds also helped me just learn something new and get to talk to people about what would be useful in a resource. And so I've been really grateful for that as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned time. I mean, time is a critical resource, and I've heard that multiple times, right? Funding gives people time to think critically about the work, right? To do those activities, right? To bring people as you did with your workshops and creating this. So we're gonna be waiting, Brian. We'd love to have you back once it's released and you start getting feedback from people as well, in real time, right? As it comes out. So we'll be waiting for sure. And the link, once it's available, we'll just add it in the description of this video so people can click on that and start playing with it, right? Because ultimately that's what you need. You want that input.
Yes.
And am I right in saying that is there potential here for version 2 and 3 maybe?
Yes, I definitely think so. Especially because this one, like I said, I've had to like cut things out, narrow the focus a little bit. I think I could totally see a version 2 or 3 where maybe some stuff gets added, some modifications or edits are made based on feedback. So totally, I would love to continue iterating and creating new versions of the workbook.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. And my last question, I promise, because this is so interesting. If people want to reach out to you and want to collaborate, right? They want to do all these things. I think it's important people connect, right? In this world, in this work. What are some areas where you are looking for partnership right now, or you foresee looking for partnerships, and what sort of questions do you encourage people to ask you around that?
Yeah, so well, one, if anyone wants any help just thinking through evaluation for those projects, like I'm happy to have those conversations. I'll just put that out there as a blanket offer. Like I would love to nerd out about this stuff with you and think about your program or event that you're trying to evaluate. But I think if folks want to collaborate on like even making more training resources for people, like if there's people out there who feel very confident or confidence is not the right word, but people out there who have a lot of experience doing evaluation, they want to make more training resources. I would love to collaborate on that. I think that this is an area where, like I said, a lot of resources exist, but maybe we can curate them towards specific audiences, and I think that would be lovely. So if people want to reach out and collaborate on those things, that would be great. If people want to think through like new data collection methods, or if they have like a really cool, innovative civic science program and they're not sure how to evaluate it, reach out to me. I would love to talk about that stuff. That'd be great.
Yeah, we'll have to leave it there, sadly, Breanne. Thank you so much for the time, and we look forward to having you back very soon.
Great, thank you.